Good evening. Welcome to this session of the 2020 Postal History Symposium, sponsored by the American Philatelic Society, the American Philatelic Research Library, the Smithsonian's National Postal Museum, and this year by the United States Philatelic Classic Society. I am Scott Tiffany, librarian and Director of Information Services at the American Philatelic Research Library. Our presenter for this session will be Stephen Walske, and the title for his presentation is Blazing Trails for the Westward Expansion, 1832 to 1849. It is now my pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker, Stephen Walske. Stephen's research and collecting interests include North American blockade-run mail from 1775 to 1865, the French Franco-Prussian War mail, 1870 to 1871, and American Transcontinental Overland mail from 1832 to 1869. Steve has exhibited frequently, and his Franco-Prussian War Siege mail exhibit won the Grand Prix International at Luxembourg, 98, and the Grand Prix National at Filex, France, 99. His Civil War Across the Lines exhibit was nominated for the Grand Prix National at Washington, 2006. His San Francisco Postal History collection entitled Heart of the West, San Francisco as a Postal Hub from 1849 to 1869 received the Grand Prix exhibition at Indonesia 2012 and the Grand Prix National at the Sescow 2008 Continental FIP exhibition. Steve's Civil War related research culminated in the 2008 book entitled Special Mail Routes of the American Civil War, a guide to across the lines postal history, co-authored with Scott Treppel. In 2005, he also co-authored a book entitled The Pony Express, A Postal History, with Richard Frajola and George Kramer. He has also published numerous articles in The Chronicle, The Western Express, The Collectors Club Philatelist, and Les Domaines Philateliques. In 2014, he wrote the chapter entitled Blockade-Run Mail during the American Revolutionary War, 1775 to 1783, in the book titled From Indian Trails to the Birth of a Nation. This was the first philatelic treatment of the blockade-run mail during the Revolutionary War. Steve was also the lead author with Richard Frajola on the 2015 Mails of the Westward Expansion, 1803 to 1861, which was awarded the coveted Royal Philatelic Society London Crawford Medal in March 2016. With that, it is my pleasure on behalf of the 2020 Postal History Symposium to present Mr. Stephen Walske. Steve?
Thank you, Scott. I appreciate that kind introduction. And to everybody who's signed on, thank you for taking some time to listen to a little bit of postal history associated with the opening of our great country. I just want to start by saying that I am a postal historian, and the emphasis is on the history. I do think that the history drives a lot of what I'm interested in terms of collecting stuff. And the letters that we can collect, I think, are physical manifestations of that history, and that's what really fascinates me. And this topic today, I think, really captured my attention a number of years ago. Mainly for that reason. I just think it's just pure history, as hopefully you'll see as we work our way through this presentation. The presentation is basically going to describe the expansion of the United States from the Mississippi River to the Pacific coast, and then the establishment of routes of communication into that vast new wilderness that was able to, in some sense, tie the whole thing together. I think one of the challenges the United States had in absorbing all this new territory was trying to find ways in which to facilitate commercial transactions, as well as just tie people together so that there was a common sense of unity that was being that was held by all. And so this map here, as you'll see, shows that in 1783, the western border of the United States was along the Mississippi River, and 20 years later, Jefferson managed to purchase the Louisiana Purchase. Interestingly enough, for those of you who don't know that, he actually was only interested in acquiring New Orleans to facilitate the commercial activities up and down the Mississippi River. But when Napoleon Bonaparte was confronted with the offer to sell New Orleans, he said, well, why not sell the whole thing? And for $15 million, we had one of the best real estate transactions of all time, maybe second only to the purchase of Manhattan Island. Things were kind of quiet. We did pick up Florida and the southeast down there, and Yamil covered that very nicely yesterday, and so I won't get into that at all today. And then things were quiet for a while until Texas was annexed from Mexico in 1845. And then the disputed Oregon Territory, which was under joint administration and settlement by both the United States and Great Britain, that was resolved in June of 1846, creating what is now the Northwest of the United States. And then finally, in what was the Disastrous War for Mexico, at least, the entire Southwest was acquired in 1848 at the conclusion of the 1846-48 Mexican-American War. Once these territories were acquired, people started going into them, and that's sort of natural. Jefferson in particular was interested in finding out what it was that he'd gotten for his 15 million. So the famous Lewis and Clark expedition was sent into the Northwest, and they went all the way to the Pacific coast in Oregon, and then returned in 1806 with glowing reports of flora and fauna, which to many people in the business people in the country meant furs. And furs was actually one of the major business, and this will be a continuing theme in this presentation, was a major business of the time. In particular, beaver hats were all the rage. And so beaver pelts were in particular demand. So people were always anxious to find new sources of supply for those. Part of and we'll develop this a little bit more fully, to facilitate that fur trade into the new area, people established, or traders established, these what are called fur trade rendezvous in the Rocky Mountains. And basically that was an ability to bring once a year supplies to trappers in the mountains to collect their furs and take them back for sale in St. Louis. The other big events that happened in terms of opening up the new Western territories were actual migrations of large numbers of Americans. The first was in 1834 to 1846, which was to Oregon. This was followed very shortly, and they overlapped quite a bit actually, was the second migration to California, prior to, interestingly enough, the discovery of gold there. And then the third was the migration of the Church of Latter-day Saints into the Salt Lake City basin. We will be covering each of these a little bit more detail in the presentation, starting with the fur trade rendezvous. And so the fur trade business was established in a fairly logical manner. And so the trappers were all up here, where all these black dots are up here. That's where the trappers were. And each of these black dots represents the location of a rendezvous in a given year, all 15 of them. And so normally what would happen every year was that one or two or sometimes three competing fur trade companies would send a caravan out across this black line up into the mountains. And they would be bringing supplies from St. Louis that they would then sell at a very large markup to the fur trappers in the mountains. And then they would buy their furs from them at deflated prices and then take them back to St. Louis and sell them at very high prices. And so this was actually a very, very lucrative business. And the annual trips left Missouri in the spring of every year. The timing was important because there had to be enough grass on the prairies to feed their livestock and their horses. But they also had to leave in large caravans together for protection against hostile Indians. Each trip took about 2 to 3 months to reach the various rendezvous. The rendezvous itself was actually pretty short, although a lot of celebration was taking place, and they lasted from anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks. The success of this model actually attracted one of the major competitors to the business, which was the Hudson's Bay Company. And their fur trade caravans were coming in from the Northwest, Fort Vancouver and Oregon. The earliest known transcontinental letter was actually carried by one of these fur trade caravans, and it's shown here on the screen in front of you. This particular letter was datelined on July 14th of 1832 at Pierre's Hole, which is in Idaho, at that rendezvous. And it was written by an interesting fellow by the name of Nathaniel Wyeth. And Nathaniel was a Boston ice merchant who had been reading about Oregon from all the various political discourse that had gone on in terms of trying to figure out how the United States could wrest complete control of the Oregon Territory away from Great Britain. And so he was interested in that. He was interested in the business opportunities there. He thought that given his background in his education, he's a Harvard man, that he could probably run circles around these uneducated yokels back out west and take over the fur trade business and the salmon business and whatever else that was out there. So he decided that he would explore the opportunities in 1832. So he arranged he left Boston in early 1832, got to Independence, Missouri, met up with one of the leading fur trade traders by the name of William Sublette. Sublette agreed to take him and his small party of about 30 men on his trip to the rendezvous, and they left on May 12th of 1832 from Independence, Missouri, and arrived at the rendezvous on July 8th. Up until now, Nathaniel is seeing nothing but sort of uneducated people that he thinks he can beat. So he writes home to his brother saying how great the opportunity is and how excited he is about being able to build a great business. He then, after writing the letter, he leaves for Oregon to further investigate what's going on the West. He arrived in Fort Vancouver on October 29th of 1832 and was taken as a guest of John McLaughlin, who was the chief factor in the area for the Hudson's Bay Company, and he would, as we will see in a second, would stay there for the entire winter. Meanwhile, he took his letters and gave them to William Sublette, and as you can see, there's an endorsement at the bottom of this letter, favor of Mr. William L. Sublette, who agreed to carry them back to St. Louis on his return with the furs. And he did so. He left on July 30th and arrived in St. Louis on October 3rd. And 2 days later, this letter was postmarked in St. Louis and rated for 25 cents for the greater than 400 miles to Baltimore from St. Louis. So as I said, Nathaniel continued on to Oregon and again had a great time. He's very complimentary of the hospitality of John McLaughlin in his letters back home, and this is one of them. It was written on January 16th of 1833 at Fort Vancouver. He had a problem in terms of how he would get this back to Massachusetts, but it turns out that the Hudson's Bay Company had established in 1825 a canoe brigade, so-called canoe brigade, because parts of the travel were done by means of canoes, that allowed them to communicate back with their headquarters in Montreal and in London. So Nathaniel takes this letter, in which again he's quite optimistic about his business prospects, endorses it favor of the Honorable Hudson's Bay Company, and it's carried by the Canoe Brigade from Fort Vancouver to Montreal on August 13th, and you can see there's the faint postmark there for August 13th. The Hudson's Bay Company kindly paid the 6 pence rate, which is this 6 here, to the border as a favor to the letter writer. And then it crossed the Lake Champlain and entered the U.S. mails in Whitehall, New York, as per this B, this large red B, which stands for steamboat. And from there, it was rated for 18 3/4 cents due for the distance to Cambridge, Massachusetts. Now, this was an interesting route that they took. And so as you can see, here's Fort Vancouver over here to the left, and they would then run up all the way into the mountains of northern Canada. And they would get to a central location at a place called Norway House. Meanwhile, another canoe brigade was starting from Montreal, and they would then be working their way west to the same point at Norway House. And these trips were very similar to the fur trade trips. The brigade from Montreal was carrying supplies and other things that were needed for by the trappers in the wilderness, and the eastbound brigade was basically carrying the furs and products that they had assembled, during the year that had passed in between. These were annual trips, And they took about 6 to 7 months, so they were non-trivial. And again, just like the fur trade trips, they left in the early spring of each year. It's likely that the two brigades met at Norway House and exchanged their supplies and then returned back to their various places. Norway House was a particularly central place because up here in York Bay, that's where the supplies, the products that had been assembled were being sent to England. So then the supplies would be offloaded, the products would be offloaded here, mostly furs, taken up to York, and the other sets of products would be taken to Montreal as appropriate. This shows a remarkable letter that was carried on a westbound Hudson's Bay Canoe Brigade trip. This is the only westbound letter that's known. It was posted on April 8th of 1844 at Wilbraham, Massachusetts, and prepaid 25 cents to Lachine, which is currently a suburb of Montreal. It was endorsed to the care of James Keith, Lachine, Lower Canada, HB Company Express to Columbia River. And of course, it was addressed to H. Henry, Bridgman Brewer, Columbia River, Dallas Station. So the vast distance didn't preclude a fairly vague address in this case here, and it did get to him though, because you can see up here the Henry docketed the letter as received by express boats on October 29th of 1844. The letter actually, it's interesting, I forgot to mention that the 25 cents paid the letter to the border with Canada, and then there was a further 4.5 pence charge that was due to get the letter from the border to Montreal, and that again was generously paid by the Hudson's Bay Company before putting it on the Canoe Brigade. Remarkable cover. So I mentioned earlier that the Oregon partition was resolved in June of 1846, and so the dividing line was established at the 49th parallel. Anything south of that basically became part of the United States. Anything north became part of Canada, or England in that case. And that meant that the HPC headquarters at Fort Vancouver would then move up into British Columbia, and there would no longer be the Canoe Brigade coming from Oregon that had been the case for the 15 years prior. For the 21 years prior. So this letter here, which was carried on that last trip, dated February 9th of 1846 at Fort Colville, Oregon Territory, which is just on the Canadian border. It was carried by the Canoe Brigade to Lachine on October 27th. You can see that right here, 27th of October, Lachine, Lower Canada. And it was returned, and then of course, HPC, maybe because things were ending, they were less generous. They just dropped it in the mail for the border. It gets to the border. They realize that the postage hasn't been paid. So it says postage to the lines not paid, returned for postage. It comes back in November 18th, and begrudgingly, the HBC pays the 4.5 pence rate to the border, and then it crosses into the United States, where it's rated for, again, across Lake Champlain, it's rated for 10 cents due to Blandford, Massachusetts. This particular letter, which doesn't have a lot of content to it, was from Reverend Cushing Eales, who was one of the pioneering missionaries who'd arrived in Oregon in 1838. So Oregon was interesting because, people had been, like Wyeth had gotten there in 1834, in 1832 rather, and a few other people had gone there, but there was not much going on in terms of interest in the United States in terms of settling there. And then a very significant event took place. In June of 1831, a delegation from the Northwest Indian tribes went with one of the fur trade brigades to the rendezvous and then to St. Louis. And then when they got there, they described a need that they had for their population to have religious instruction supplied to them, because they were only being educated by the quote unquote black robes, Catholic priests, and felt that this was a deficiency in their education. Well, this galvanized the Protestants in the United States, and they moved very quickly into action. This was a whole population of people that was waiting for their enlightenment. And so the very first to go was a Methodist by the name of Jason Lee, who went in 1834 again with Wyeth, as we'll return to in a second. And then he was followed very quickly by the first Congregationalist missionaries who went overland to Oregon in 1835 and 1836. And then in 1838, Lee, who now obviously had been there for 4 years, came back to the United States via Westport, Missouri. Basically his mission was to convince the United States to establish a territorial status for Oregon. But on his way there to Washington, he lectured about Oregon at pretty much every stop. And one of those stops was in Peoria, Illinois. And then there was the very first non-missionary group left from Peoria called the Peoria Party in May of 1839, basically inspired by Lee's description of the great things that were there in Oregon. And then, of course, as I mentioned, the Oregon Partition changed everything in terms of the establishment of the United States presence there. The overland route to Oregon was pretty much the standard route that had been pioneered by the fur traders since 1825. But so it basically leaves the Missouri River here, some jumping off point from the Missouri River, follows the Platte River up towards South Pass, and then once through the mountains, moves up northwest into Fort Hall, and then they would then continue on again through, and Fort Hall's in today's Iowa, continue on via the Snake River to the Columbia River, and then this is where all of the settlement was taking place in Oregon, and that's where all of the Protestant missionaries were establishing their missions. So returning to our friend Nathaniel, so he wrote, when we last left him, he was writing a letter in Fort Vancouver in January of 1833, and then a little less than a month later, he left Oregon overland for the Green River Rendezvous in Wyoming that took place in July of 1833. When he was there, he contracted with one of William Sublet's competitors by the name of the Rocky Mountain Fur Company, and he contracted with them to bring supplies to them at the 1834 rendezvous the next year, and to buy all of their furs, and thought he had a firm agreement to that effect. Very excited because now he's underway. He returns to Boston in November of that year and begins to pull his brigade together, as well as acquire all the necessary supplies that he would need to have for the rendezvous the following year. He then, a very timely fellow, he then got to Independence in April of 1834, all ready to go. He leaves on April 28th of 1834. He's 5 days ahead of his main competitor, which is, in this case, is William Sublet, thinking he's got him by the horns now. This is going to be fun. And reaches the Hams Fork rendezvous in Wyoming 4 days after Sublet had arrived there. So our poor professorial Boston ice merchant had learned a little bit about logistics from these uneducated Western guys. The reason why it was so important is that the first person to a rendezvous was typically would leave with the vast majority, if not all, of the profits. They would be able to sell all of their supplies immediately, and they were able to buy all, if not most, if not all, of the furs that were available for sale at the rendezvous. So poor old Nathaniel pulls into the rendezvous on June 17th, finds that he's been trumped, to use a term, and then 4 days later writes a letter from the rendezvous back home, describing the not so great prospects that are there in the fur trade business. And he gives this to yet a third fur company called the Bonneville Fur Company, a fellow by the name of Michael Serret, who carried it to St. Louis for him. Serret left the rendezvous on July 10th and then reached St. Louis in late August. He gives it there to the merchants to which he sells his furs, Von Full and McGill, on September 1st, who then mail the letter in St. Louis, unpaid, with 25 cents due to Cambridge, Massachusetts. It arrives there on September 16th, and then this is addressed to Nathaniel's wife, by the way, and it was forwarded twice within Massachusetts for additional charges. Meanwhile, Nathaniel doesn't quite know what to do. He's sitting in in a rendezvous with a lot of supplies and no buyers. So what he decides to do is to head again for the Northwest. And en route, he stops on the site of what is today Fort Hall and decides to build a fort, a trading fort, that would hold all the supplies. And then over the coming year, hopefully he would be able to sell his supplies to the local Indians as they brought in furs. And so then he would be able to sort of have on a continuous basis what he wasn't able to accomplish in one fell swoop at the rendezvous. And Fort Hall was named after one of his financial backers, I think, hopefully in an effort to keep the guy from foreclosing on his loan. Nathaniel then continued from Fort Hall into the Northwest. He had an unsuccessful effort to dislodge HBC's monopoly on the salmon fishing business, and then finally decides that this is not for him and returned home in November of 1836 with his tail between his legs, having failed in virtually every effort that he had, petitioned his old boss to get back into the ice business, took over that business, and became a multimillionaire. So there is hope for all of us. Turning back to other Oregon letters, again, these are remarkable things that the fact that they survived. There are so few of them. This is a letter that was posted in Baldwin, Maine on March 20th of 1839, and it was prepaid, as you can see from the bold page 25, to Missouri, in particular Westport, Missouri. And it was endorsed, interestingly enough, to the care of Reverend Jason Lee, missionary. Now, recall, I described Lee before as having returned back east to petition for territorial status for Oregon, and had stopped and had come through Westport en route to Washington, D.C. And so it was expected by the letter writer that he would return by the same route, which in fact he did not. Instead, he assembled what's now known as the Great Reinforcement, some 200 missionaries, put them on a boat with him himself called the Lausanne, and went around the Horn and reached Oregon by sea as opposed to overland. So the poor postmaster at Westport is left with a problem, which is what can he do with this letter since Lee is not coming through? And there was a provision in that allowed postmasters, when there are no post routes or postal contracts to go into a particular region, that they could then contract with individuals to carry that mail, that letter, in exchange for the amount of postage that's on the mail. And so that's what happened here. The Munger Griffin Missionary Party was heading west, overland. This was a Congregationalist party. And they stopped in Westport. The postmaster sees an opportunity, tells them that for 25 cents they can take this letter to Oregon. They agree to do that. They were accompanying the fur trade caravan that left Westport on May 4th of 1839, and they stopped at the July rendezvous and at Green River, Wyoming. And then they continued on to the Northwest with the Hudson's Bay Company caravan. And the letter it was recorded as having been received on September 16th at Shimmickane, Oregon. And so just a remarkable example of a letter that was addressed to Reverend Elkanah Walker, Oregon, nothing more than that. And yet it got to him in what is a reasonable period of time. Back to our friend Henry Bridgman Brewer, he was also running back home. And this is a letter that was dated February 23rd of 1842 at Waskepem, I think I'm mispronouncing that, Mission. And it was initially endorsed to the Hudson's Bay Canoe Brigade. You can see it says per HB Co. Express, and then he crossed it out. And he wrote in his letter as a postscript, I have an opportunity of sending this direct to the States. And he gave it to, according to his diary, he gave it to a fellow by the name of William Fowler, who was traveling overland to Missouri to bring his family back to Oregon. And Fowler was kind of pokey in terms of getting there. He didn't get there until December 7th, which is when he posted the letter in Westport, Missouri, again rated 25 cents due to Franklin, Connecticut. And had the original endorsement had not been overruled, this letter would have arrived as much as 3 months earlier than that. So it goes. Wasn't such a great opportunity. All right, so the second migration was to California, and prior to 1821, and I think Yamil described this as well, Spanish control of the whole area was pretty tight, and they allowed no trading and no immigration of foreigners into the region. So there was virtually no foreign presence in those territories. Mexico got its independence from Spain in 1821, and then decided that it was probably in their commercial best interest to open the region. So they allowed immigration, and they allowed a lot of trading up and down the coast. And so Americans began to become a little more interested in exploring what was possible there. In 1826-27, a famous trip, the mountain man Jedediah Smith took an overland trip to California. He basically opened up what is now known as the California Trail, as we'll see in a second. But again, there was very little activity that was going to California. The vast majority of the immigrants were still heading to Oregon. And finally, in May of 1841, the Bidwell Overland Immigration Party headed for California. It was the first major immigration party that had California as its destination. And immigration gradually increased pretty steadily until an initial peak in 1846. Meanwhile, President Polk had run for president on a platform of acquiring all these Western territories, Texas, Oregon, and he particularly had his eye on California, as did, by the way, England and Russia. So he was quite concerned about about losing the opportunity to acquire California from a fairly weak Mexico. So they decided to send some naval and military forces into the region, as we'll describe in a second, to sort of set things up. Meanwhile, in 1846, right at the peak of this initial peak of the immigration, the Donner Party set out for California, and their disaster is well known. It also became well known back east very quickly, and so immigration was basically cut by 2/3 in 1847, and didn't recover until news of the gold discovery dramatically changed everything for California. So the pivotal event in this portion of California history was the Mexican-American War, because that's what made it American. Basically that war, which many people consider to be a somewhat immoral war in terms of a powerful northern neighbor taking advantage of a very weak southern neighbor and grabbing huge swaths of its territory, but that's maybe for a different presentation. War was declared on May 13th of 1846. This had been precipitated by the annexation of Texas in 1845. Mexico was making warlike noises, and so Polk saw his opportunity and basically precipitated combat along the Rio Grande, and that set armies in motion into Mexico. And then also another army called the Army of the West left from independence in 1846 with the objective of capturing Santa Fe, which he did in August. Once in Santa Fe, General Kearny divided his forces. Some were going to stay there, some were going to head down to Chihuahua, and then he was going to take a group and basically sort of take the short version of the old Spanish route and cut across the plain directly to Southern California. As you can see, there were two major routes that were available to people who wanted to go to California. One was the one that we've somewhat described. It basically paralleled the Oregon route up until Fort Hall, and then instead of going to the northwest, they would go southwest towards Sacramento and San Francisco. But then you had the old Spanish Trail, which had been in place for a long, long time from Taos to Los Angeles. He started to follow that, and then I think he cut it short by going across the Colorado River and then into San Diego. And then, of course, the other big event was in February 12th of 1848, Mexico ceded Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, Nevada, and California to the United States. Major outcome. Just as a quick note to cover this portion of the trail, because there was an army now in Santa Fe, they established a military courier system between Santa Fe and Missouri. This is an example of one of those letters. It's postmarked Santa Fe, spelled with two E's, November 20th. This is in red. It's a military postmark of 1848. A courier by the name of Newman left on November 20th that day. He had to return because of excessive snows on the mountains. He left again a month later and arrived in Leavenworth on February 1st, where it was postmarked and rated for 10 cents due for the over 300 miles to Jacksonville, Illinois. So in California, the American forces were starting to assemble. And basically, Polk had personally assigned Colonel Fremont, this fellow here, this handsome fellow here, the task of going overland with a small military group to be there as necessary if the English, for example, decided to move on Monterey. He wanted to have some ground forces in place. While he was there, Colonel Fremont instigated what's known as the Bear Flag Revolt in Sonoma, California, and this started the whole set of unrest. Shortly thereafter, a month later, Stockton, this is at Commodore Stockton, his squadron occupied Monterey and San Francisco in the name of the United States. Again, a month later, Stockton's Marines were sent down to Los Angeles when they captured Los Angeles. Things were looking really, really good until the Mexicans counterattacked and recaptured Los Angeles in September, much to the chagrin of the Americans. But finally, in January of 1847, the Treaty of Cahuenga ended the war in California. And meanwhile, General Kearny's force, which had been going across the desert, basically arrived somewhat disheveled in San Diego. And there ensued, I'm not going to get into it much here, an interesting tug of war for control of California between Kearny, Fremont, and Stockton. Stockton named Fremont the military governor of California, even though Kearny was the ranking officer and had instructions from Washington to assume that position. Kearny ordered Fremont to absorb his forces into his force. Fremont refused, thinking that he was under the orders of Stockton. And so in May, June, all three of them returned back to the United States. Kearny basically ordered Fremont to go back with him, where things would not turn out well for Fremont. And we'll talk about that in a second. Meanwhile, gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill, and Sam Brannan was famous for grabbing large chunks of gold and then running through the streets of San Francisco saying, "Gold in the mountains, gold in the mountains," and it precipitated an absolute frenzy. Everyone just dropped what they were doing and headed up into the mountains. Sam did something else, though. He didn't head to the mountains. What he did was he went and bought up every shovel in California and every mining pan in California, and was able to sell them for unbelievable profits, and became a very wealthy man. He, unfortunately, though, was the leader of the Mormon community there, and this behavior was somewhat inconsistent with their beliefs, further accentuated by the fact that he refused to pay his 10% tithe on his ill-gotten gains, and so he was excommunicated shortly thereafter. But he stayed a millionaire, so choose your poison, I guess. So Kearny, as I said, went back to the United States and carried a mail. And there's about 6 or 7 of these known. This particular one was daylined at San Francisco on April 30th of 1847 by the first officer on the trading bark Tasso. It was carried from San Francisco to Monterey by a military regional mail that had been established by Kearny that left San Francisco on May 3rd and got to Monterey on May 5th. And once in Monterey, it was put into Kearny's mailbag, and he carried it across the country. He left on May 31st and arrived in about 3 months later, pretty typical time, in Fort Leavenworth on August 22nd with Fremont in tow. And Fremont was promptly arrested and charged with disobedience to a superior officer and was court-martialed. He did manage to survive that disgrace, but he was bitter about it for the rest of his life. This letter in particular here was that the Kearny then hopped on the steamship from Fort Leavenworth to St. Louis. Steamship, this was called the Amelia, gave the letter to the purser on board, who then marked it Steam 10, which is 10 cents due to Boston. And it gets to St. Louis on August 26th, where it's postmarked again, another St. Louis 10 marking, and sent on its way to Boston. Commodore Stockton also returned overland, and he carried not an official mail, but he carried some mail. And this is an example of one. This is the only known one, although there may be others that exist. This particular one was datelined on March 24th of 1847 from a sailor aboard the USS Congress, which was Stockton's flagship. And it was at anchor in San Diego. A nearby ship called the USS Savannah was actually supposed to leave that day, which is, he writes about in his letter. So he was quite anxious to get it on board that ship so that it could go around the Horn and back again. However, the sailing of the Savannah was delayed until September 8th. So Stockton decided to take that letter along with some others, I imagine, on June 20th from Monterey. They took their time crossing the country. He arrived in St. Joseph, Missouri on October 22nd, 4 months after leaving, posted the letter on October 30th with, again, 10 cents due to Philadelphia. And then, of course, with respect to the gold, this letter here was written by a woman who had great fortitude, in my opinion. She had just arrived on May 18th of 1848 at Monterey after having gone around the Horn on a sailing ship, and was headed to Hawaii to join her missionary family. When she got there, she found out immediately that Colonel Mason, who was the military governor of California in replacement of General Kearny, was going to send an overland courier back to the United States, carrying gold samples for the U.S. government to inform them as to what was going on out there. And so she endorsed it overland, gave it to this guy, B. Chouteau, who then left Monterey the next day, headed for Los Angeles on July 4th. And then he took the old Spanish Trail via Taos and Santa Fe to Missouri, and then finally mailed the letter on October 11th in St. Louis, again with 10 cents due to Western Massachusetts. The third and final big migration was the Mormons and the Church of the Latter-day Saints. Basically, first, just covering the map, this shows the map between Salt Lake City, which became the center for the Mormon community, and the jumping off points on the Missouri River. The Mormons actually had been founded in 1830 by Joseph Smith, and had been somewhat persecuted and hounded and driven away from various places. They were driven from upstate New York to Ohio, then to Missouri, and then finally to Illinois. Finally driven out of Illinois, they concluded that they would not be welcome in the United States anymore. So they found a location on the west side of the Missouri River, which is in Mexico, at a place that they called Winter Quarters. And it's across the river from a place called Canesville, which will be important for postal reasons in a second. And in April of 1847, Brigham Young led what's called the Pioneer Party along the Platte River, which is the old Oregon Trail, past Fort Laramie, into South Pass, and then instead of going up north, went through Fort Bridger and then found the Salt Lake Valley. Walked into the valley, looked at it, and said, "This is the place. This is where we will settle," even though it was owned by Mexico at the time. And this became the major route for all immigration that was taking place between the United States and Salt Lake City. Of course, Salt Lake City was ceded to the United States as part of the settlement with Mexico on February 12th of 1848, and then responding to petitions by the local residents on January 18th of 1849, the Salt Lake City. The United States Salt Lake City Post Office was established. However, they neglected to put in place any postal routes, and so the post office could manage local mail, but there was no way to move mail anywhere outside of the Salt Lake City Valley. The earliest letter known, in private hands at least, is shown here from Salt Lake City to Missouri. And this was written on January 9th of 1848. At Salt Lake City, and it was still part of Mexico. The writer had been with the so-called first migration to Salt Lake City in September of 1847. And he writes in his letter that he's got the opportunity to send this letter back east by members of the Mormon Battalion who were returning to the United States. And the Mormon Battalion was an interesting little unit. It's 550 men who were formed in July of 1846 in Missouri to participate in the Mexican-American War, and they were offered to the United States as a peace offering, basically, by Brigham Young to sort of keep things calm between the United States and the Church of Latter-day Saints. The Mormon Battalion had one of the greatest marches of all time. If you read their histories, they left Fort Leavenworth on September of 1846 for Santa Fe, following the Army of the West and General Kearny. They reached there in October of 1846 and immediately pivoted west and headed for San Diego. And they built, unbelievably, a wagon road all the way across from Santa Fe to San Diego, across the deserts and all that other kind of stuff. It was actually pretty amazing. And that was one of the, that became later on an important road for mail systems going to the Southwest. They reached San Diego on January 29th of 1847. By then the war is over, and so they hung around for a bit and were mustered out 6 months later in Los Angeles. A number of them migrated up to San Francisco, hung around there for a while. Two of them were the ones that initially found the gold that was found at Sutter's Mill, and then they began to head back across country, back to Missouri, presumably to find their families once again. So this letter here was carried by one of those groups of soldiers who had come from San Francisco to Salt Lake, and they were then returning to Missouri to their families. This letter was posted in Linden, Missouri, on May 11th of 1848, and rated for 10 cents due to Indiana. Interesting letter. Now, I mentioned that the Salt Lake City post office did not have any contract routes in place to help carry the mail beyond the confines of the city itself. And again, there was a provision that allowed the postmaster to contract with individuals, parties on a trip-by-trip basis to carry the mail in exchange for the amount of postage that was carried. Well, a fellow by the name of Almon Babbitt took that a step farther, decided that he would set up his own special mail service. We call it the special contract mail in the book that Richard and I wrote. And he charged 50 cents a letter, would carry it from Salt Lake City to Kanesville, and then back, and then in the other direction as well. So this letter here is postmarked Salt Lake City, California. So Salt Lake City was, just Salt Lake, California. So Salt Lake was considered part of the California Postal District of July 16th of 1849. This is the earliest known postmark from the Salt Lake City post office. It was given to Almon Babbitt himself, actually, who left on July 27th and arrived at Kanesville on September 3rd, where, and it had been rated for 10 cents due to Massachusetts and Salt Lake, by the way. So it was just transited right through Kanesville and headed back to, headed for Massachusetts. This is a fairly interesting letter that is the only known westbound Babbitt special contract mail. This one was postmarked on June 7th of 1850 in Concordville, Pennsylvania, with 10 cents due to basically Salt Lake City. He endorsed it down here by way of Kanesville, Iowa. Once it got to Kanesville, it was given to the Mormon courier Orson Hyde, who left on July 6th and arrived in Salt Lake City on August 15th. Nice letter. Babbitt also advertised that he would carry mail to California, although the opportunities for doing that were substantially fewer than between Missouri and Salt Lake. But this is a letter, the only known letter carried by a California Mormon courier, that was posted on August 12th of 1850 in Sacramento. As you can see, it's got an integral, in the postmark, an integral 12.5 cent intra-California rate due. So again, this is Sacramento considering Salt Lake City to be part of the California Postal District, so it's getting the local rate benefit from that, even though it was addressed to Deseret. The Mormon courier, Amasa Lyman, left Sacramento on August 16th. It reached Salt Lake City on September 29th. This designation of Deseret, this, by the way, it's also addressed to the postmaster or to Mr. Brigham Young, so it's got a nice address on it. But this designation Deseret, so Brigham Young had proposed to the United States. He had a somewhat rocky relationship with them, but was always pushing He wanted to have the territory of Deseret to be defined as the area between the Sierra Nevada mountain range and the Rocky Mountains. Pretty large territory. I don't know how many states are in there right now, but there's quite a few. And the U.S. did not take him up on that offer. Instead, in 1850, they created a number of different territories, among which one was Utah, and then continued to have a rocky relationship with Brigham Young after that. So to finish, I want to give you an example of the very first contract overland mail. This is possibly my favorite cover of this whole grouping. Just a remarkable piece of postal history. So this is a letter that was postmarked in Lawrenceville, Pennsylvania on August 17th of 1846. He paid 10 cents to Independence, and then he endorsed it down very carefully to the care of the postmaster at Independence, Jackson County, Missouri, to be forwarded the first opportunity. And this being sent to Sonoma, Upper California, Mexico. Pretty difficult place to get mail to. Meanwhile, there was a fellow by the name of John Shively, who had been appointed the first postmaster on the west of the Rockies at Astoria, Oregon. And he just happened to be on his way west, coming through Independence, where this letter was waiting for an opportunity to be forwarded. Now, first, a couple words on Shively. Interesting fellow. He had first gone to Oregon in 1843, trying to seek his fortune. He made a land claim for what is virtually all of today's Astoria, Oregon. Was contested in that claim by the Hudson's Bay Company, which had a competing claim, and they basically drove him out. So he had to return to the United States in 1845 with poor memories of Oregon. Hung around there trying to find something to do until the June of 1846 Oregon Partition Agreement. And then he kicked himself into action, petitioned for the postmaster job at Astoria, got it, was named in March of 1847 as postmaster of Astoria, and was sent overland to assume his new post. So he went through Independence on April 28th of 1847, and according to instructions he carried from the Postmaster General, collected all the mail that was there in Independence to take it to the West Coast. He reached Astoria on September 7th, and then kicked into action as the postmaster. He postmarked at Astoria, Oregon, and then he rated it postage 50 cents. So he rated 50 cents too. We're not 100% sure what the 50 cents, how he arrived at 50 cents, but the speculation is that he charged 40 cents for the transcontinental trip across the country, and then 10 cents for the trip from Astoria to Sonoma. Not clear how he expected to get the 50 cents back into his pocket, but in any event, he still charged the letter. He then found a ship called the Wyeth that was heading from Oregon down to San Francisco. It arrived there in November of 1847, and it was presumably delivered by hand to Mr. Kilbourne, Ralph Lee Kilbourne, in Sonoma, Upper California, Mexico, sometime in November, December of 1847. And that's a fitting conclusion to the presentation. Just a remarkable cover. This is ex Griswold, by the way, and I just think it's just a fantastic piece of postal history. So with that, I will entertain your questions.
Thank you, Stephen. That was a really interesting talk about the period of Western expansion, particularly during that time. The first one that I have here is sort of a twofold question. Is there a reason why the Canoe Brigade, I think you talked about that right at the beginning, is there a reason why the Canoe Brigade would have stopped operating? Why would the resolution of the U.S.-Canada territory dispute stop the Canoe Brigades from going?
Actually, I don't know if it stopped or not, to be honest with you. It just became irrelevant to the people that were living in Oregon. Because if the Canoe Brigade had continued, it would have gone from British Columbia straight across. And I suspect they still continue to use that method.
And this is the librarian in me. I know your work with Richard Fajol is considered the resource for this period of history. Are there other resources that you would recommend?
Well, we refer to a lot of primary resources, and so there are some very extensive, almost contemporary reports of the whole thing. If people really wanted to get into it, I would point them to our book first. But if you really want to get into it for various portions of it, the Bancroft series of books is just incredibly detailed and covers pretty much all of the areas of the West.
And how did you get started sort of researching this and sort of collecting in this area?
Well, it's an interesting story. So the real inspiration was Floyd Griswold. Floyd was just a remarkable collector who had an incredible eye for material and had collected just the most fantastic stuff for a number of years. And when his collection became available, sold through Spink, I began to study it, and I was lost. It was over for me at that point in time. Once I figured out what was going on here, in postal history, I'm really interested in particular in studying postal systems that are under stress. And so this is an example of that. I mean, getting a letter from Missouri to Sonoma, California in 1847, it's just so hard to do that. And so trying to figure out how those systems operated and how they accomplished their task is just ultimately fascinating to me.
I have a question. This person has read that there was a numbered mail route from the east to Salt Lake, which was the first designated mail route. Also, the route from San Antonio to San Diego has been described as the first. Can you clarify?
Yeah, I think the August 1850 route from Missouri to Salt Lake City was technically the first, but they were very close in terms of time, in terms of when they were established. The one to San Antonio was also established right around that same period of time.
Did some mail routes fail to gain traction and then just fail? If so, were there significant losses of mail as a result of the delivery of mail?
No, I don't think, some mail routes were abandoned because there wasn't enough volume that was being carried across them. And so you could call them as failing that way. There aren't huge stories of the mails being intercepted by hostile people or adverse events that blocked the mail from being delivered. And so, no, I think they were actually pretty effective at getting the mail through. It's surprising.
Okay. You mentioned early on about the Hudson Bay Company. Did the Hudson Bay Company leave the Oregon Territory without any objections? Was there a dispute?
No, I think that this was a settlement that was agreed to by the governments of the United States and Great Britain, and so the Hudson's Bay Company really didn't have a choice. John McLaughlin, who was the chief factor, the head guy of the Hudson's Bay Company in all of the West, decided not to move with the Hudson's Bay Company. He left the company and settled in Oregon and became an American. So I think there were some interesting movements that were taking place back and forth. I suspect a lot of the Hudson's Bay people that were in the Portland, Fort Vancouver region probably stayed because that was their home.
Yeah. This is more of an abstract question. If you could go back to this period of time, what would you do differently or work to improve upon?
I don't think I would compete with William Sublette.
Yeah.
But I think in terms of the postal systems, there's nothing that really jumps to mind. I did not cover. I mean, I think the thing to remember is the thing I didn't cover. These are the overland routes. In late 1848, the United States established its first West Coast contract route, which was the Via Panama route, and that really became into full operation later in 1849. So they really had it. That was sort of the backstop. I think the opening of these overland cross-country routes really were laying the basis for later on the ability for the post office to keep its postal routes entirely within the confines of the United States. That became really important in 1859.
Okay. I think with that answer, we'll conclude this session of the 2020 Postal History Symposium. For all those that joining us for this session, we want to thank you for your attendance and ask that you join us on behalf of the 2020 Postal History Symposium, the American Philatelic Society, the American Philatelic Research Library, the National Postal Museum, and our co-sponsor for the symposium, the United States Philatelic Classics Society, and thanking Stephen for this presentation this evening.